So you mentioned there about nicotine, about the cigarette after sex. Caffeine, one of the most common stimulants that I think 80%, 90% of people use on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's the second most traded commodity on the surface of the planet after oil, so it tells you everything. It's the largest drug experiment that's repeated on the planet every single day.
Wow. What is there to know about sleep and caffeine?
Probably, I think most people now, through idiots like me, understand some of its temporal dynamics. What I mean by that is its half-life. Caffeine has a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours, which means after about 5 to 6 hours, 50% of that is still in your brain, which means it has a quarter life of 10 to 12 hours for the average person. So drink a cup of coffee at midday, perhaps a quarter of that caffeine is still in your brain at midnight. It's highly dependent, however, on your sensitivity, which is determined by a specific enzyme. That enzyme is what we call a cytochrome P450. It's a liver enzyme, and it's a variant on a gene that's called the CYP1A2 gene, which is just, word spaghetti at this point, word salad. But simply variations in that gene means that you are either quick at clearing the caffeine or slow. And everyone knows what type that they are. And I'm pretty slow too. I am a caffeine sensitive individual. But nevertheless, just keep that in mind, that in terms of caffeine having that temporal dynamic, I would say the dose and the timing make the poison. Try to cut yourself off after about probably 4 cups of coffee maximum. 3 is probably really where I would draw the line. But again, it depends on your sensitivity. That's not where it stops though, because even if you're one of those individuals that says, look, I can have 2 espressos after dinner and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep, that may be true, but the caffeine will actually keep you out of the deeper stages of sleep. And we did some studies where we gave you 200 milligrams of caffeine, which is a hefty, drip,
big whack,
sort of, cup of coffee after dinner. And that robbed you of about 15 to 22% of your deep sleep. And to do that, I would have to add about 12 years of to your life. So I could age you by a decade in terms of your deep sleep quality by just having, 2 espressos after dinner. The other thing about caffeine is that it will fragment your sleep. So it will litter your sleep with these awakenings. And just like alcohol, which does the same, but by way of a different mechanism, caffeine is going to reduce the quality of your sleep non-consciously, because those awakenings are so brief, you never commit them to memory. So you wake up the next day, you feel lousy, but you don't remember waking up, so you don't put 2 and 2 together. That said, though, I've actually changed my tune on coffee. I would absolutely say for anyone for whom they like coffee, absolutely drink coffee. And the reason is because if you look at coffee, the health benefits associated with coffee are astronomically numerous and remarkably robust statistically. Furthermore, perplexingly for someone like me, if you list all of the benefits that it's de-risking in terms of diseases, and you stack up what sleep will do in terms of de-risking all of your disease states, it's almost a one-to-one match. So people are coming along to me and saying, well, can you square that circle for me? I don't understand how that can be true. The answer is that the coffee bean contains a whopping dose of antioxidants. And because we're so deficient in our antioxidant consumption, because we're deficient in our whole food dietary intake in this modern world, the coffee bean has been asked to carry the Herculean weight of all of our antioxidant needs. So no wonder it looks like drinking coffee is associated with health benefits. It's not the caffeine, it's the antioxidants. Case in point, if you look at the benefits that decaffeinated coffee produces, it's the same.
Wow.
So it's not the caffeine, it's the coffee bean.
I looked at the Whoop urine review last year. It's actually just come out recently, and I haven't been through it. And they talk about your behaviors and what's been related between your behaviors and your sleep and your recovery and your strain and so on and so forth. But they also have anonymized and aggregated the data from all of the other Whoop users. The number one predictive behavior for a good night's sleep was caffeine. The number one predictive behavior for a good night's sleep was caffeine. So is there a method, or would you ever encourage somebody to use caffeine in terms of its timing to help bring you into land from an adenosine perspective, so that you sleep more easily so that your latency is reduced or whatever?
From all of the data, there's nothing to say that you should advocate for it as a sleep aid. I think there's some data to say it may be equivocal that at least moderate doses of caffeine have any effect on your sleep. The problem with some of that data is that it's associational. So it could be that people who are drinking coffee are people who also are very thoughtful because they can
Healthy
afford.
user bias.
So healthy user bias. They're the same people who are probably drinking 2 cups, then they're going to the gym. They're exercising. Sleep is fantastic. Sorry, exercise is fantastic for sleep.
But that's the interesting thing about the Whoop data, though, because that is a relatively, I would guess, homogenous group of people, all of whom have got a wearable. They're tracking lots of things.
Right.
And even within, because these are behaviors done by different or the same individual on different days.
Yeah, it's within subject design is what we call it.
Thank
sort
you.
of longitudinal within subject.
Yep.
And so the other possibility is that it's still on days when you're drinking caffeine or days when you are
More fatigued.
Therefore,
See, this is why we need a scientist to help me pick this apart. Okay, so that's sleep and caffeine. What about sleep and alcohol?
Yeah, drink lots of it. It's fantastic for your sleep.
Said like a true Brit.
It's right there on our passports. Alcohol is probably the most misunderstood sleep aid that there is out there. Alcohol is in a class of drugs that we call the sedatives. And sedation is not sleep. But when you have a couple of nightcaps in the evening, you mistake the former for the latter. And if I were to show you the electrical signature of your sleep with alcohol versus without, you would see how different it is. It's not the same. That alcohol will actually, it pushes you into what looks like deep, slow wave sleep. But it's kind of the faster, slow brainwave activity. So it's sort of the less nutritious of those deep, slow brainwaves, but it's simply sedation. The second problem with alcohol is that, like caffeine, but through a different mechanism by way of acting on the sympathetic fight or flight branch of the nervous system, it will make you wake up more times throughout the night. And once again, they're so brief that you don't usually commit it to memory. The other thing is that because of that sleep fragmentation that principally is happening in the first half of the night, this is why on your sleep tracker, when, if I look at my Oura Ring data, I don't typically drink, but even if I have, a glass, I get hit not just with this. Another thing I'm going to tell you about REM sleep, I lose a good amount of my deep sleep. And it turns out that it's really the fragmentation of your sleep early on in the night when the alcohol concentration is highest, when your liver and your kidneys have not had the chance to metabolically clear it. And when you get fragmentation in the first half of the night, you're not getting your deep sleep. And as a result, there's a great study that demonstrated that alcohol after dinner, 1 glass, decreased the amount of deep sleep. And as a result, produced a 50% drop in growth hormone release. 50%. I don't know what you'd have to age an individual by to get them to have a 50% drop in growth hormone. But so it's consequential. It's not epiphenomenal. Just because you don't get deep sleep, you may say, well, so yes, and so what? What's the consequence of that lack? Well, one is that you don't get your growth hormone release for reparation and repair. But then the other thing about alcohol, people love me, don't they? I'm saying all this. Someone once told me, when we listen to you, your personality is like the greatest prophylactic known to man.
Oh, you're the fun police.
Thanks for, yeah, exactly. Yeah. God, and that goes together already with my bloody acerbic personality. Anyway, nevertheless, alcohol also is very good at blocking your REM sleep. And it turns out it's not the alcohol, it's the metabolic byproducts of it, particularly the aldehydes. And it's the aldehydes that will essentially act like a sort of jamming up of the cogs of the gears of the generation of REM sleep. So you become REM sleep deficient. This is the reason that people will sometimes say, God, we had 2 or 3 bottles of wine last night when friends came over at the weekend. And then I slept in late because we went to bed late. And I was having these crazy dreams, just wild, crazy dreams. What's happened there is that, firstly, REM sleep comes mostly in the second half of the night. You get most of your deep sleep in the first half of the night. If you're sleeping later into the morning, that's the REM sleep rich phase part of your sleep cycle. So your brain has a different taste preference for what it wants to eat from the finger buffet of the sleep menu at night. Early in the night, all it wants to do is feast on deep sleep, very little REM. As you go through into the second half of the night, it likes to switch its taste preference to REM. The further you sleep later into the morning, the more REM sleep you get. If you want to increase the amount of REM sleep, one of the things you can do is just sleep half an hour later into that morning and you'll start to get more REM sleep. But what alcohol will do is it will start to block the amount of REM sleep that you've been having for most of the night. Your brain is so clever, though. This sleep is so strongly conserved across biology, across phylogeny, that sleep emerged, as I said, with living organisms and has stayed there. It's one of the most preserved behaviors that we see in any living organism. And it's preserved at the level of the stages too. So your brain, what I mean by that is, it's understanding how much REM sleep you, Chris, should have had across the night when you've had a few too many drinks. And it keeps a clock counter of how much REM sleep you should have had and you've not obtained. And finally, by those late morning hours on the Saturday when you've slept late, your liver and your kidneys have finally excreted all of the alcohol. So in the last hour or two of sleep, your brain gets the REM sleep it will have normally obtained, plus it tries to get back that which it's lost. And it's called a REM sleep rebound effect. And that's why you have really intense dreaming and you have these really crazy, bizarre experiences. Does your brain get back all of the REM sleep that it lost? No, it doesn't. It can only accumulate about 50% of the debt. So you will still be REM sleep deficient. REM sleep, it turns out, if you want to say, give the head-to-head challenge, which is more important, non-REM versus REM? Well, I'm going to firstly tell you that all stages of sleep are important. Different stages do different things at different times of night. But the ultimate test of what's more important is presumably death. How quickly do you die when you don't have one versus the other? They did a series of studies back in the 1980s that will never be replicated again because I think they were just, so barbaric. They started to sleep deprive rats to the point when they died. And what they found is firstly that rats will die as quickly of food deprivation as they will of sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation will kill you just as quickly as no food, about 11 days in the rats. Then they said, okay, let me now selectively just deprive the rats of deep sleep so they still get REM sleep, or they get deep sleep and we remove REM sleep. And when they looked at that, the rats died from REM sleep after about 20 days. So REM sleep was, still lethal. A lack of REM sleep was still lethal. Non-REM sleep, they still died, but they died after about 60 days. So in other words, rats will die quicker from REM sleep deprivation than they will from deep non-REM sleep deprivation. We all predicted the opposite in those studies. Why? Because I told you that non-REM sleep was the original OG in terms of the evolutionary course of sleep. It was the first stage of sleep. So surely the first stage of sleep that emerged in the course of evolution would be the fundamental, elemental, most important. The opposite was true. Great study then back at Harvard. And what we find is that a lack of sleep, short sleep, as I said, shorter your sleep, shorter your life. And it's sort of it's a decaying curve, which is that, the less sleep that you have, the higher and higher your death risk. But let's come back to that 7 to 9 hours of sweet spot, because something odd happens. When you get past about 9, your death risk does not keep going down. It goes back up, as if more sleep after 9 hours is deathly. And people have said, well, that's proof that sleep can actually kill you. If you look at the data, at least one of two things is happening in those studies. When you get sick, what is the first thing that you typically want to do?
Sleep.
Exactly. And it turns out that the reason is that your immune system has a very adaptive network that when you get sick, it brute forces a set of chemicals to induce you into more sleep because it knows that the Swiss Army knife of health, the best thing that it has to combat disease and sickness, is this thing called sleep. So it drives you to sleep more. And so what was happening in those studies is that whatever the disease was,
sickest people were sleeping
sickest
most.
People were sleeping more.
It's like an unhealthy user bias.
And it looks like artificially more sleep is killing you.
It's just that the people that were sleeping 9 hours or more per night what there was something underlying that was causing them to.
It was too powerful for sleep to overcome, despite sleep trying. The other reason is because of sleep quality versus quantity. Typically, what we find is that people who have really bad sleep quality stay in bed for far longer. And sleep quality also predicts all-cause mortality. So as a consequence, it looks like people, when they say, what time did you get into bed? What time did you wake up? That's how they measure the amount of sleep, as it were, poorly as it is. Those people who are in bed for 10 hours died sooner. And the reason is not because they were sleeping 10 hours. It's because they were trying to get back more sleep because the quality of their sleep was so bad that they had to stay in bed for longer, and therefore poor quality of sleep masquerades as longer quantity of sleep being bad for you. But to come back to it, this Harvard study then looked at how much of different stages of sleep people were getting across the lifespan, because they were able to do this with fancy sort of technology. And what they found was that when they put non-REM sleep, again in the same statistical model with REM sleep beat out deep non-REM sleep in humans to predict your all-cause mortality. And here, it wasn't this reverse shape, J-shape, like total sleep deprivation, like total sleep duration, which is, once you get past 9 hours, it starts to hook back up. No, with REM sleep, the less and less that you had, the worse and worse your mortality risk. It was a linear relationship. And so across animals, across human beings, REM sleep seems to have been, if you want to do the math, which I wouldn't argue for anyone to do, if there is one stage of sleep that's mortality more important than the other, it would be REM sleep, which is also the reason maybe to raise caution regarding alcohol and then maybe THC.
What about melatonin, other sleep supplements that people are probably quite heavily relying on? Interesting. You'll know this being from the UK, but Americans may not, that melatonin, something that you can just buy in CVS here, is kind of hard to get a prescription for in the UK. Drugs like Zolpidem, Ambien, you do not, you need to be like fucking insomniac for weeks and weeks in order for your doctor to step in pharmacologically and help you with your sleep in the UK. It's very much not a thing that your GP would ever do. But some people from the UK can get a hold of melatonin in some way or another, especially a lot of people in America are using it, and other supplements, the magnesiums of the world, the L-theanines, what do you sort of come to think about here?
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that if any of these supplements or any supplement stacks that are out there that promise you the royal road to, resplendent sleep, if they really were doing what they claim, the drug companies would have been all over them 20 years ago and would find analogs and would have been making billions of dollars from them. The fact that they've left them to the wayside tells you a lot about really what their efficacy is. And the drug companies are ruthless, but it took George Lucas, I think, something like 30 or 40 years to amass about $4 billion in profit from the Star Wars franchise. It took Ambien 21 months to do that. So they know that these drugs, if they are out there, and any molecules like these supplements, if they are good sleep aids, they will be very strategic. Melatonin, I think, certainly over here, it's so easily purchased. You go down, any grocery store, and in the health food section, there's this big purple subsection, and that's the melatonin section. And you've got, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams. I've seen 50 milligrams. Firstly, 5 milligrams, 10, 20 milligrams, these are what we call supraphysiological doses, meaning that they are levels of melatonin that your body would never naturally release, far higher than your body's natural tendency. So the fear here, although there are some studies that people have argued this is not the case, but the fear is, just like testosterone replacement, at some point your testes, if you're exogenously injecting, will just stop producing innate testosterone. And once they stop, they don't restart. The worry is the same with your pineal gland, which is going to release melatonin, that if you keep exogenously giving your brain vast amounts, it says, well, you're giving it to me, so I don't need to produce it anymore. And once it stops, does it ever restart? There are some data where they looked at an individual who was blind. And the reason that they were looking at this individual is because when you're blind, and depending on the level of blindness, if it's at, let's say, the level of the retina or the optic nerve, you don't receive light signals. So you don't get the light to reset your circadian rhythm. So you're bouncing with your sleep all over the place. It's very difficult for these patients. So what we typically do is we give them exogenous melatonin to at least feed them the signal of melatonin darkness at night to try to regulate their sleep. And they did a study where they were tracking the melatonin of this individual and they were giving exogenous melatonin, and then they stopped. And then looked to see, did that individual stop producing their own natural melatonin? And the answer was no. So people say, well, that's a good demonstration. And it was about a 30-day experiment. Other people, I think, have looked at across about 6 weeks of dosing. And when they stop, the people keep producing it. And some people have argued that's the evidence then that we don't have to worry about that. The problem is most people don't use melatonin like that. They've been using it for 3 or 4 years. So we don't know. And it could be perfectly harmless. The second concern about melatonin is that it's a hormone that regulates the timing signal for when you should sleep. It doesn't participate in the generation of sleep itself. So melatonin is like the starting official at the 100-meter race. It brings all of the sleep racers to the line and begins the great sleep race, but it doesn't participate in the sleep race itself. That's a different set of chemicals and compounds. So that's why when people have done what we call meta-analyses, where you get all of the individual studies looking at melatonin and sleep, and you put them all together in the same big statistical bucket, and you ask, what's the overall effect? Melatonin only improved the speed with which you fell asleep by about 3.9 minutes, which is not that much more relative to placebo. And it only improved your sleep efficiency by about 2.2%. So again, largely trivial. Now, I think, however, despite touting those statistics, I think there is a subset of people for whom melatonin is sleep generating. And therefore, melatonin is not just the starting official, it's also one of the racers. And we don't yet understand why. I think one of the ways that melatonin could be a sleep generating agent, and this will bring me back to CBD in a second, is that melatonin can make you cold. Melatonin has the ability to produce not hypothermia, don't worry about that, but it will drop your core body temperature a little bit. And it turns out that we do need to drop our brain and core body temperature by about 1 degree Celsius to fall asleep and stay asleep. It's a reason that it's so hard on those summer nights when it's brutally hot and you've got no air conditioning. You can almost not fall asleep despite how tired you are in a warm room. But in a cold room, you typically can sleep. It's always because the cold room is at least taking you in the right temperature direction for good sleep, as melatonin in some individuals may be mildly hypothermic and move you in that direction. So I think I'm fascinated by that and I want to pick that apart. But for most people, firstly, it's not going to move the needle. That's the reason that no doctor has ever prescribed melatonin for people with insomnia. You have to have a circadian disruptive clinical syndrome causing the insomnia to receive melatonin. That's where it can be helpful. The other thing two other things about melatonin, if you go down that purple aisle, now a large part of it is dedicated to pediatric melatonin for kids. And what we know is that melatonin is a bioactive hormone. We did some work and we were looking at great scientist Craig Canapari at Yale, and we spoke with the FDA about this. Admissions to the hospital for melatonin poisonous overdose have increased by 503% in the past 10 years, which is a stunning statistic. Now, granted, melatonin, for the most part, is a largely inert compound in terms of its safety profile. But the worry with the pediatric component of melatonin nowadays from the sleep community is that studies done back in the 1980s, 70s demonstrated that in juvenile male rats, essentially male rats going through adolescence, when they were given higher doses of melatonin, it stunted their testicular growth and it caused testicular atrophy. So imagine if I came along to a PTA meeting, a parent-teacher association meeting, and to the parents and the teachers, I got up there and said, tonight, I'd like you to start dosing your child with bioactive hormone. And I'd like you to dose them with a magnitude that is far higher than their bodies would ever naturally release. And it's a hormone that will also disrupt their reproductive gonadal development. And I'd like you to do this every night for the next couple of years. Who's with me? and you get taken off stage rather, rapidly. And again, I don't mean that that's hyperbolic in terms of an example, but I do think we need to be a bit more thoughtful, certainly about melatonin in pediatric populations. The final thing about melatonin, it's now been replicated. They did a study originally where they looked at least 20 different brands off the shelf of melatonin. And then they tested based on what it said on the bottle versus what was inside the capsules. What it turned out was actually what you were swallowing was anywhere between 83% less than what it said was on the bottle to 464% more.
Oh, fucking hell. Right.
Than what
Okay,
it
so
said.
that 50 milligram capsule has become a monster.
It's a Wild West. You don't know what you think because it's not regulated by the FDA over here.
Wow.
And what was even worse is that within any one vendor, the amount of variability from one batch to the next was just as large.